Thank you. And I'd like to invite the panelists if you would like to ask each other questions, if you have points to make with each other. We have about 15 minutes for you to engage in that dialogue.
I have a question for all three of you, actually. Is this Mike? I have a question for all three of you, and that is, could any of you speak to the linkage between the creation of the National Museum of the American Indian and the Repatriation Act? The connection between the museum creation and repatriation.
I'll take a shot at that. I will take a shot. Oh, this is yeah. Okay. I will take a shot at that because I remember when, in those early days of the NMAI, what was going on was a great deal of discomfiture in the museum community about the repatriation law, period. The very first session of AAM, the American Alliance of Museums, in which I spoke, was on the subject of repatriation, and you'd have thought that I was attending a funeral or something. I mean, there were a number of museum folks who were deeply disturbed about what was happening, and there was this comparative going on about how could you have legislation, Mr. Director, that sets up the National Museum of the American Indian and at the same time contains provisions which could potentially empty their coffers. Of course, the latter never happened. But for me, it was, the two were absolutely consistent. In other words, the creation of the museum and the fact that it was in the very same authorizing legislation. The other half of it was the Repatriation Act. And I think that it was this. I think institutions like the National Museum of the American Indian had kind of a moral imperative that spoke to the future preservation and survival and survivance of contemporary Native communities. That was our area of business. So why wouldn't we have a stake in that? And if you have a stake in that, then the provisions in repatriation acts make perfect sense, because first of all, they divide up slightly differently. Those relating, I think, to the return of funerary objects, human remains, etc., that's a moral imperative, flat out. The other part of it is that, but it is also that when you're talking about ceremonial material, cultural patrimony, etc., you're talking about that which is essential to the maintenance of sustaining culture into the future. So I thought that was kind of a coalescence, if you will, of interest on the part of the museum and the matter of repatriation, that they actually sat together and not necessarily apart. And then that it was also over time, this great fear that all the collections were going to disappear, etc., was just a canard, period. That didn't happen. That's never what Native people themselves intended necessarily in any event. And there was a kick line when somebody would ask me about that was that, well, repatriation has gone on at the NMAI now for about a decade. We began with a million objects. We now have, 988,000 that still remain in the collection, and I think we can do business on that basis. It's not a problem.
Thank you.
Yeah, let me just add a little more. It was my understanding that the leverage that Indians had to get repatriation was because of the plan to create this museum and the to get Indian support to bring the Hay collection here. The Indians only do it if the Smithsonian agreed to repatriation. And at a meeting in Santa Fe between Suzan, Harjo, Walter Echohawk, and McCormick, Robert Adams, they agreed to repatriation at that time. So I think that the museum community probably felt that Adams sold them out, which was not the case.
I'll add one other kind of backstory to that, and that is that basically the repatriation legislation that existed in the very beginning days was primarily our Authorizing Act, which affected only the Smithsonian. NAGPRA was coming along, but it wasn't there yet. There was actually an internal debate, and Adams took the right position ultimately, but there was an internal debate when the repatriation legislation was being taken up as to what position the Smithsonian would take on it. And so you may recall that initially the Smithsonian was not covered by NAGPRA. It was something that came by way of amendment about 5 years later. It was in the form of an amendment to the to the authorizing legislation of the NMAI. But there was, I remember going to an early meeting. I don't think Suzan was actually present there, but it was a meeting out in New Mexico, probably in 1990 when NAGPRA was coming up, and I was yelled at by numbers of other museum people because the Smithsonian itself was not yet covered by NAGPRA. But that was actually tactical on our part because at the time there was still some debate going on within the Smithsonian about what the attitude would be. So we kind of preempted it. We did at the NMAI by adopting a repatriation policy completely apart from any other legislation that we felt was right. And then when the amendment happened in the 1990s, that did really bring NAGPRA to home to the Smithsonian. What was interesting is that the standards established in the NAGPRA legislation are really the ceiling, if you will. For us, when it was amended, they were the basement, which is to say we were at liberty to go beyond them if we wanted. And so that gave us the ability in the NMAI to do, without being collared about it, repatriation across international boundaries to First Nations in Canada and to communities in South America.
Wow. Thank you. That's great.
Any other questions? Because it's lunchtime.
Anything else you'd like to add? Okay. Well, thank you so much to all of you for sharing these thoughts and this journey that you've taken and the impact and where it goes forward. I'd like to thank the audience. We're going to break now for lunch. You can go across to Mitzi Time, or you can go out or go up and take a look at treaties, nation to nation. We'll reconvene here at 1:30. So we'll see you soon. Thank you so much.
Thank you.